On today's episode of the Unveiled podcast, I sit down and have an immensely valuable chat with Jan Winhall. Jan is an author, teacher, and psychotherapist. She is an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Social Work, University of Toronto. Jan is director of Focusing on Borden, a psychotherapy and training centre. She's partner with the Polyvagal Institute and a coordinator with the International Focusing Institute. She teaches internationally on trauma and addiction. And she has written a book all about her model, the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, and that is what we focus our discussion on today. And when I say focus on, Jan actually takes us in depth through her model. We have visuals, which will be in the show notes, but also displayed on our YouTube and Spotify videos if you're on those platforms. This is a real deep dive into Jan's Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, where that comes from, those words, and who originated those ideas. And then we get into discussing her 6 Fs and the model of how to actually understand how to use this in your life. Whilst Jan's book focuses specifically on addiction, as I'm sure you will grasp from this podcast, this model can be used no matter who you are, what you're dealing with, and what you're facing in your life. I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And just to say, we discuss a conference during this episode because Jan and I are actually going to be in the same room in a couple of weeks' time. We have linked the details for that in the show notes so that if you are wanting to attend, and you can do this both in person and virtually, you will be able to do so. That's the Polyvagal Institute gathering. This is a brilliant episode. It's jam-packed with insights and theory and practical applications. I really hope that you get value from this, and go and find Jan wherever she can be found. All of those links are in the show notes. Jan Winhall, welcome to the Unveiled podcast.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm really excited about today because for so many reasons. I have read your book, which we're going to talk about. I'm really excited about digging into your model and the way you work and what you do. So let's just orient our listeners for a moment and just tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do currently. And then we're going to kind of go back into an origin story. And then we're really actually going to share screens, dig into your model, and actually understand more about the way you work. But let's start at the beginning. So just give us a little bit of a brief introduction to you.
So, what am I doing right now? More and more, I'm actually writing, which I'm really finding wonderful. It's like discovering a part of yourself that you knew was there, and kind of waiting for the right time to emerge. That's what it feels like. And so I love writing, and I'm getting into it more and more. So I wrote the book, and I've just brought out the International Body Psychotherapy Association, which I hope people will check out because it's a wonderful organization of body psychotherapists in North America. And there's also a European branch. And we're really working hard to bring the body more and more into psychotherapy. So that's really my mission, the core of it, really. And I just published an article with Steve Porges in that journal and curated the journal, which was really fun. So yeah, it's a very exciting time in my life right now. I'm about to turn 69.
Anyone on YouTube,
I just feel like it's just really in some ways the best time ways, the best time in my life, certainly in my career. Because when you have 40 years of experience, you just know in your own self, in your own body, where you've been, what feels right and makes sense in terms of the work. And you've got all this experience behind you. I do, and we do, those of us that are older doing this work, that helps to reference and put kind of in context what we're seeing. And that's so the context for me is really filling in. It's really filling in. It's making more and more and more sense to me what addiction is, for example, or what healing is, and how incredibly vital and important it is to understand the autonomic nervous system. So I didn't jump on board with the polyvagal theory 2 years ago. I've been doing this work for a long time and curious about the autonomic nervous system for a long time. So we'll get there.
We will. And so anyone who's a long-term Unveil listener will already be hearing words and going, oh, this is why Victoria's interviewing you, because anything to do with the nervous system my listeners know I'm legitimately obsessed with, and anything to do with addictions and healing is what we do at our company and in our podcast. And so I have read your book, and you have a fascinating journey to get to where you are today. And I want to explore all the things. I kind of want to get into all of it. And I'm not worried about being more technical and more kind of like, let's talk about the model that you have and all those things. But I kind of want to work out where you started with this, because your why, your reason for the addiction being the on-ramp, if you like, for all of this is it's deep and it's intimate, and I really would love to explore it with you for our listeners, just to understand, where did this all begin for you? Where did thinking about even psychotherapy, let alone body psychotherapy, where did any of that kind of start?
Well, the real start of that was, of course, where I think it always is for us, which is in my own experience, which I go into in my book. So the way that I wrote my book was through experiencing. So inviting the reader to go into your own felt experience as you move through the journey with me.
Yes. And just to double click on that, actually, as I say, I have read your book. It's actually sitting right here beside me. And I loved that because it made the whole journey through your book a felt sense experience for me as a reader. And it took me a while to get into the flow. And I was like, oh, hang on a second, I'm doing like a body check-in whilst I'm in the middle of reading. What am I doing? And then I kind of got halfway through and thought, this is frankly genius, because actually it's literally modeling the kind of tying the body and mind together as you're walking me through your own history and the development of your model. So just to double click on that, absolute stroke of genius. We will link to your book in the show notes because I think everyone should read it. Sorry, return to your story in terms of where this all started.
That's true. And that genius really belongs probably to many people, but to Eugene Gendlin, who is the father of the term felt sense. And he taught me that. He taught me to connect into the body in a more kind of conscious way. But I always knew that. Somehow I always knew that. Even though I have my own trauma history, I never lost that connection to the whole experience, what we call the felt sense in the body. And I think that for whatever reason, that was an enormous gift, right? To stay connected to my own embodied experience. And so it started there because I was trying to figure out what's going on with me. I'm a teenager and I'm really anxious and upset about things, and I don't feel good and I can't ground myself. And so I ended up finding a really great therapist. And while he didn't reference directly to the body, he was a meditator. And he was very Rogerian in his background, Carl Rogers' beautiful work. So Gendlin was actually a student of Carl Rogers. And so all these things started to link and make sense to me in terms of how I ended up going down the path that I did. So from there, I learned so much about deeply listening to oneself, right? And connecting into what that feels like in the body, and to what Gendlin called felt shifts in the body. And those shifts happen when the autonomic nervous system is adjusting and adapting to how safe we feel.
Right.
And that was the link that I put together, was that link between the felt shifts in the body where we just feel better. You know, when you feel tight and and then you go to your girlfriend and she loves you up, and your body just kind of releases and you feel better. Like, what happened there? It feels better, And what happened was what Gendlin would describe as a felt shift in the body that released into this place of carrying forward in life with growth and healing. And this I connected up with the polyvagal theory in terms of, I said to myself, those felt shifts are like shifts in the autonomic nervous system. And I checked that out with Steve Porges, and he said, and I'm like, okay, now this is really cool, right? So I'm a teenager, then I end up going to school, and I finish graduate school, M.S.W program, and I get a job. And my first a job assignment, if you can believe this, I mean, it's just crazy, is running a group for young women who are incest survivors.
That seems like a weight as a first job. That's That's
And
a
that's
lot of pressure.
how I start my book, right? And
Right. Yeah.
you read the beginning, and
Yeah.
people said to me, I can hardly read that, right?
I
Like,
tried to read your introduction when I was literally in the middle of somatic experiencing training weekend. So it was already a heavy weekend. And I took your book to read on a lunch break for ridiculous reasons. And I started reading and I was like, we're not going to read this now. Like there's a lot of like, but it helps to make sense of it for the reader to understand what you were witnessing when you were incredibly young and incredibly green in this work. And I was shocked that it was what you were doing, but also what a gift to the industry and to healing, because it's obviously led you into your work that you do.
Yeah. And the thing is, though, that I was young, but I was also radical, right? I wasn't buying this psychiatric model.
Yes.
I'm not at all. Partly because I was young, and partly because it just didn't fit with my own experience in psychotherapy.
Right.
Which was all about deeply listening to what was happening inside me and honoring that without layering it with interpretations. And that was really the gift.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got to the women, I knew that that's what I had to do for them. What was given to me, I knew that. So while it was overwhelming, and I did develop vicarious trauma, absolutely, because nobody talked about that then, 40 years ago.
Right.
Nobody.
No.
But I stayed with the process of just listening to what was happening for them with what I call non-pathologizing ears.
Yes.
Just listening freshly, as Jen would say.
Yeah.
And what I heard were these horrific stories of what was happening to these young women and how they were coping. And how they were coping, I eventually put together as adaptive ways of self-soothing through the nervous system. But that back then, what we were told, and we're still told, it's still a very pathologizing model. The DSM is still ever present.
Yeah.
That these women were sick, and that they needed hospitalization. And really, what they needed was, they weren't sick; they were dysregulated because they were victims of violence.
Yeah.
And they didn't need hospitalization; they needed safety. And that was not happening in the psychiatric ward. And it still isn't.
No. I've been in one, and there is no, there's no felt sense of safety in a psychiatric unit at all.
And that's outrageous. When you really think about it, that is completely outrageous.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's why we're here. Right? That kind of sums it up. We're here because what's happening in terms of healing is outrageous in hospital settings.
Yes. Yeah. And so in terms of that on-ramp and what you were witnessing, because some of our listeners may not fully grasp what we're talking about, you and I are so steeped in the world that we're almost having a conversation with terminology that's a bit ahead of people who've never heard of this.
Yeah.
What were you seeing that didn't match up with the DSM, the pathologizing, the labeling? And how did that spark off the inspiration in you to think, well, this doesn't make sense. There has to be a different way.
Yeah. So what I was seeing and hearing were women describing, first of all, these horrific experiences, but also how they were coping with them.
Yeah.
And so how they were coping with them were through self-harming and self-soothing behaviors, like cutting the body, drinking huge amounts of alcohol or doing a lot of drugs, binging and purging food, picking at oneself, engaging in really unsafe sexual behaviors. Things like eating bars of soap. And I didn't understand it, but what I was being told in the pathologizing model was that they were masochistic or attention-seeking, and they almost all had diagnoses of borderline personality disorder, which still happens today.
It does, yeah.
And again, it's outrageous.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
outrageous. It's so misunderstood and disrespectful.
Mm.
So when I listened, I didn't buy that.
Mm-hmm.
But what was so intriguing to me was that they knew intuitively that these behaviors brought them relief, but they couldn't explain it. They didn't understand it intellectually, but they knew it intuitively.
Yeah.
And then what happened was that these behaviors that were self-harming, also in becoming self-soothing, became addictive because they worked well.
Yeah.
And so back then, it was the feminist therapist. Feminist therapists understood that back then. Judith Herman, in her beautiful book, Trauma and Recovery, she understood, and we talked about these states of numbing and flooding. That's what we called it back then.
Yeah.
And we didn't really talk about the nervous system, although she did. When I reread Trauma and Recovery and when I was writing my book 2 years ago, I realized, she actually talks about the autonomic nervous system, and she talked about the sympathetic state that we all feel of flight fight when adrenaline pumps because you're trying to mobilize and get out of a place where you feel unsafe, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so the nervous system is just monitoring, am I safe? Am I not safe? This is the basis of polyvagal theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she related that to this kind of flooding state that we recognized as therapists. But we didn't, of course, we knew about the numbing and the dissociation, but we didn't call it the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve because we didn't have polyvagal theory.
Right. Right. And so
back
it's
then
so
it was numbing and flooding. It was real simple. And I realized that these behaviors that they were describing to me that seemed so crazy in the context in which they described them. So when you listen to the context of their life, nothing is safe. There's no escape anywhere.
Yeah.
You're at home and your father's raping you. There's no escape. So what does the body do? The body goes into this state where it turns, in a sense, against itself, but in a paradoxical way, it's also helping the self to numb.
Yeah.
And then if you're in numb too long, it switches up into flooding into that sympathetic waking up thing of adrenaline, right?
Yeah.
And cortisol.
And that's a beautiful description without using any complex terminology of what's happening in the human vehicle as we seek to state shift away from pain, because we were always going to be away from suffering, that orientation away from, but that just essentially really imbalanced seesaw of numb, flood. I mean, yes, we go into terminology and Stephen Porges has been instrumental in giving us more understanding because like you, and I say this in one of my training modules, it's like, I didn't grasp, and actually you wrote beautifully about this in the book in terms of, I went through that process of thinking, if I'm in, so we used to think parasympathetic, good, rest, digest, that's the nice, relaxing thing. Sympathetic, maybe I'm in danger. But I had that real issue with like, okay, so I'm clearly not feeling good, so I must be in sympathetic, but everything in my system was shutting down. It was a slowness. And I was like, but that doesn't make any sense because surely sympathetic, I should be speeding up. Everything should be moving or there should be some change. Right.
You got it.
And so that was my
That was Steve. That's what he said is, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense because he was studying little babies that were premature.
Yeah.
And babies that were premature, whose ventral part of the vagus, the good stuff, the grounded place, wasn't developed yet.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so babies, you'd think if they were sick and premature, they would be in sympathetic.
Yes.
But they weren't. Their heart rates were lower than normal instead of up in sympathetic. Right. And so just like you were saying, you saw that. That's the paradox he saw. Yeah. Well, how can something that's supposed to be helping you actually be hurting you because the heart rate's lowering to a point that is dangerous?
Yeah.
But conserving.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because when you actually break it down without using the terminology, and we'll talk a bit about like actual, and you've mentioned a couple of the terminology in terms of dorsal vagal and ventral vagal. it doesn't take a genius when you actually break it down to what you experience. Everybody can relate to this somewhere. Everybody has this instinct where they switch on and go, oh yeah, of course, that has to be true. And I know that, from these models in terms of Porges, and then Levine with the somatic experiencing, done it through looking at animals or looking at different kind of like younger humans, like you say, the babies. It's like this sense of like, oh, well, obviously there has to be more at play here, even when you look at the vagus nerve itself, which is so complicated. But also what I love, and the point that you made in your book, was about that sense that most of the like receptivity from that vagus nerve is going back from the body up to the brain. It's
80% of the information that goes up into the brain is coming from body sensation and felt sensing.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
And at that point, you're like, right.
Yeah, we live in a Western culture that really idealizes cognition.
Yes.
And that's a problem because we also, the brain is in the body. We've forgotten that we live in our bodies.
Right. We've forgotten that the thoughts are
you know?
Yes.
And this brings us to this beautiful, one of the concepts that Steve Porges talks about, it sounds scary in the beginning, but the intervening variable. It's like, I thought, what is he talking about? But as you stay with it over time, and I tried to make it clear and as simple as possible in the book, because we want it to be accessible. And I'm no neuroscientist, believe me, good Lord. But the intervening variable is so important. This is the body, the autonomic nervous system, right? So we're taught in school that there's a stimulus and then there's a response. And what he's saying is, wait a minute, what's in between, what's intervening between the stimulus and the response is the body and the nervous system. It's the ANS. It's like, so something happens, right? I'm walking down the street and somebody bumps into me. So my response is going to be colored by this intervening variable, which is where I am in my nervous system.
Yes.
If I feel safe and good and connected to people, I'm going to say, oh, somebody didn't see where they were going. Big deal. If I'm in fight because I'm upset about something and I'm like ready to bash the world, somebody bangs into me and like, what the hell is going on? Right? Like, and so that completely changes my response. And we need to understand that as therapists.
Right.
Because when we know where our client is, then we can understand how and why they're responding. And so and also how we are. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of stuff in the personal development world that still gets this wrong in terms of pathologizing the behavior. So to use your example, going from like raging out on somebody on the street, you get sent to anger management classes. And it's like, well, no, the anger was just the reaction that came from the fact that the system was in a state of dysregulation to begin with. Let's go further back. And so this is what I love about the world that you inhabit and this kind of conversation around this, because it's like we are destigmatizing end result behaviors because we're understanding their origin story and the genesis from a dysregulated state and a dysregulated system.
Exactly. And when we understand that context, then those behaviors become adaptive.
Right. Yes.
Right. So I like to think about addictions as adaptive responses and dissociation and multiplicity and all of those things, adaptive responses to maladaptive environments, not people.
Yeah. Yes. And the thing that I love about this is that it really helps offset the shame, because shame to me is the biggest block between problem and solution. It's like the shame in the middle is the thing that lots of things that I do is about that bit, like just getting rid of that chunk so we can get into what's actually there. And what I love about the way you approach these women in this group from a very early age and from very young in your career was like, nothing was a problem to you. You were just curious and intrigued as to, well, what's this the stimulating force that is leading to this adaptive behavior in the addictions, in any sense, addictive behaviors, addictive to drugs or whatever it was. So I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, very, it's the most freeing, that kind of paradigm that I've found. If we think about addictions as being a sickness and a brain disease, I guess some people feel better about themselves if they feel like they're sick, rather than the old way, which is still very prevalent too, which is they're bad.
Yes. Yeah.
They're immoral, they're doing these terrible things. When you understand addiction through the autonomic nervous system, you see that, addictions are how they function in the nervous system is to shift states very efficiently often.
Right.
From, like if you're in that sympathetic, you can't settle yourself and you binge and huge quantities of food, for example, it numbs you. You go to sleep and you get relief.
Yep.
Or, this is a fascinating one, if you are wired to go back to the place where the body excreted these endogenous opioids that numb you. So if you're sexually abused, and in that state, your body releases endogenous opioids so that you dissociate and you're not there to protect yourself. How else could a person survive that? Nobody, I mean, really.
Yeah.
Dissociation saves us.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
It's a gift. It's a gift from the body in terrible environments, right? The problem is that we get stuck, and we can talk about that. But in those unsafe environments, thank God we have that.
Yeah.
And so bodies then are wired. There's a neural pathway that goes back to the origin where the endogenous opioids were released. So then what happens is you grow up, you grow older, and years go by, and your body's wired. It takes you back to unsafe sexual experiences where bodies know to release endogenous opioids.
Right, of course.
And you dissociate and go into what we call then this dorsal branch of the vagus nerve that Steve named, right? Which is the old primitive part of the system that shuts down like a reptile.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because so many of these models kind of tie into one another. I was looking at Lawrence Heller's model, the NARN model, and then getting to that bit where he's talking about the promiscuous sexual behaviors and that kind of stuff that happens in complex PTSD, so early developmental trauma. And for me, like layering these understandings and seeing where these things come from and seeing that as a stimulus seeking, or we're always seeking some kind of chemical state to help us shift or re-regulate, and they all interplay together, and these kind of fascinating models that we can now understand. It just changes the lens through which you look when you're working in service, when you're working as a therapist or a professional at healing arts of any description.
Yeah, and then you can say to your clients, as I do, like, addictions are they just function in the nervous system to shift you back and forth. Because if you go to too much of a numb state, the body will then shift into adrenaline to wake up, to activate. Of course, it doesn't take you to a grounded place, but it takes you out of a deadened place.
Right.
And so the addictive pathway is the trauma feedback loop of going from, flooding with sympathetic flight, fight into numbing and shutting down and then back again. And that's addictions. I mean, they're very complicated in many ways, but basically that's the function of addiction.
Sure.
It's what Steve calls state regulation strategies.
Right. Which is just
what
they are.
They're propellers. They propel us back and forth between one dysregulated state to another because not enough safety is available to us for the body to settle down into what is called that ventral branch of the vagus nerve, which is above the diaphragm up into our face where we're engaged right now.
Yeah, and I before we dig more into your model and how you've tied together the polyvagal theory with Jen Lynn's felt sense stuff, I just want to make sure that we've been really clear that this is really intelligent from the body. And I will share my own experience. Like, people know that I'm working with a coach at the moment, and we really tried to like support my parasympathetic system during during the first time we actually met in person. And it was, I mean, it's hilarious now. It wasn't funny at the time, but I had this great parasympathetic experience. I was very settled. And then within about 2 hours, my system went drastically into sympathetic overdrive because I wasn't safe in that state, particularly once he'd left and I was kind of on my own again. It was like, oh my God, I'm now really vulnerable. I'm going to like shift massively gears and go straight into sympathetic overdrive completely naturally. My body did it itself. My heart rate was through the roof all night, but it was just an adaptive response to, well, it felt lovely, but it wasn't actually that safe for me in that moment. And so much of this, just learning the way your own nervous system kind of works is, you know, it's part of the journey to healing in my perspective anyway.
Yeah, because to be present is really, really threatening to a body that has lived in a lot of trauma. So much of the skill in our work is learning how to titrate that, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And we would say in focusing, generally would talk about getting the right amount of closeness and distance.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great point to segue into this, because I didn't really know a lot about Jenlin. I know stuff from other models and obviously somatic experiencing, but really the kind of really easy steps of like focusing and being in that place. So I'd love you to explore and explain that for our listeners. It would be really lovely to kind of get a sense of not only Jenlin's kind of way of doing it, but also tying it into the polyvagal thing, which you've done beautifully within your kind of model.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, a really good way of doing that is to just pause for a minute. Are you open to that?
Of course. Yeah.
All right. So, if we begin to pause, then the first thing that's so important to notice, right, is does it feel safe to pause? Because focusing is really simply the process of connecting in with a whole integrated sense of experience in the moment. So that means that you can feel into your feelings. You know, how am I feeling right now? You can feel into the body sensation, the memories that are carried, like in this experience right now, right? What memories do I carry about that? And the thoughts. But to go in there and really pause with silence and connect in and close your eyes, that can be, as you were just pointing out, very threatening. Right? So I always like to start with that to make sure that people appreciate that it's adaptive to not go there when it doesn't feel safe. And so then I just encourage people to pause, and if it's okay, and just notice something around the room.
Sure.
Like a more meditative state, right? Which is not focusing. Focusing is not meditation.
Right. Yeah.
But the first step of focusing, if you decide to go a little bit further than Jenlin called clearing space. And in that, we basically take all the things that are jumbling around in there, and one at a time, we put them aside. One at a time. And what's so interesting is that bodies know how far away, how much distance that issue that just happened yesterday with so-and-so needs to go in order to be able to just settle yourself. It's a bit like making a list.
Yeah.
But knowing that in that list, things are going to need to go a little closer, a little further away.
Right.
So that eventually you can go, okay, I'm right here with you. And there's nothing in between you and me. I'm fully attending to what's happening in you. And I'm really connected to a quiet place in myself. And that he called clearing a space. And that's step one. And the way that he got to this was simply by doing research and finding out who did well in therapy and who didn't. And what he found was that the people who did well in terms of being able to make big changes in their lives were people who were connected to their bodies. Surprise. So he said, well, then maybe we can help people who aren't connected to their bodies. So let's make 6 steps to help them get in there. So step 1, settling things aside.
Yes.
You know, so that you can start to slow down a little bit. And then step 2, is to notice. Often it will come with a physical sensation, like maybe, for quite a while there, I would have like a tightness in my neck, very common one, right?
Yeah.
That was across here. It's so interesting. I have it very, very little of it now, but I had it when I was writing. And I thought, it's because I'm sitting in front of a computer all day or something, right?
Yes.
Well, I'm still sitting in front of a computer, and I don't have it now.
Right.
So what does that tell you?
Yeah.
That it was actually not just a tightening of muscle because of a physical, a posture or something.
Yeah.
That there was a felt sense there. And what does that mean? It means there was something my body was holding in there that was connected to feelings and experiencing, and that I needed to pay attention to. Not just physically going to a physiotherapist,
right?
But those of us who know focusing, who know felt sense, who know to go into the body, would be to pause and be curious and ask into that, to say, what's that all about in there? And when you do that, particularly we focus with partners, when you do that with another person who's keeping you company, and asking you about that, and just gently pausing to give time to pay attention to it, because we don't do that.
We don't do that. Yes. Yeah.
So that's huge.
Yeah.
Pausing to pay attention, inviting something that's uncomfortable, and doing it with somebody who knows how to listen deeply.
Yes.
No interpreting, no getting in the way, but also helping you to regulate your autonomic nervous system. So that's really what the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model is. I put those two things together, those two body processes of introception, which is working with that felt sense in there and asking it what it needs. So, there it is, and it's tight, and sometimes a metaphor will come or an image will come, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the right hemisphere that's activated there in the body. And then when you keep staying with it, then sometimes you can just gently drop in a question, what does this place need? And it's not from up here. It's not like, what does this place need? I'm going to follow this logical left hemisphere way of getting there.
Yes. Yeah.
No. It's dropping the question down and not worrying about the answer.
Right.
So what Jen would always say is nothing has to come. And then, of course, it just frees you up to be with whatever's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he would also always say, welcome the uncomfortable, because that's the place that will give you the most information about how you're living your life. And as long as you can learn how to regulate that uncomfortable through practices that we have with closeness and distance in therapy and healing, and lots of therapies have that, right? Lots of them. And the nervous system. So working with the state and recognizing, okay, so when I start to go in there and feel into that, my heart's racing. Okay, what's happening? Where I've shifted into sympathetic, into that flight fight place. Doesn't feel safe to pay attention to this. Body says, right?
Yeah.
Just scary. So then we learn about titrating. Well, what do you do then? Well, you bring the body back to a place that does feel safe.
Yeah.
Because we work in collaboration with the nervous system. The body, leads the way in that sense. It doesn't lead the way when we're triggered.
Right.
So that's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah. Well, and the thing that has really struck me in the last kind of few months, probably this year, has been that ventral vagal portion of all of this. It's like everyone in one world is talking about, machines doing away with humans. And I'm over here going, hang on a second. The humaningness of things is absolutely fundamental to the regulation of everything. And it's such a fundamental part of what makes us us. And often I find, and I don't know what you think about this, but I almost think it's the therapeutic bit, like being met is therapy in and of itself. If you do nothing else, is kind of, yes, we can have all the fancy models and all of the things are necessary, but the most important sometimes is just being, as you said, heard, seen, listened to deeply.
Presence. Because again, this brings us into these places where both interoception and neuroception, so interoception being the felt sensing of your experiencing in the moment, and then neuroception, Steve's term for how bodies keep us safe in the nervous system. Right? And that's an unconscious process. It's like your temperature. You don't say to yourself, gee, I'm sick, I better raise my temperature.
No, you don't.
And you also don't say, gee, I'm not safe, I better get into flight fight.
I better activate my sympathetic branch of my nervous system. Hang on a second.
That's where bodies know.
Yes.
And they just go there, right? Yeah. So when we meet each other in that place, that's the concept Steve calls co-regulation.
Right.
That's presence with two people together. That's what we would call the relational felt sense of two people connecting together in this way that feels engaging socially with each other, and it feels good. It's grounding, and it's like what we're doing right now, right?
Right.
It's good. We're connecting. We get each other. Yeah.
And there's no meaning. There's no additional kind of let's just make up a story about what this means in terms of anything. And that I think people get, particularly even in the spiritual world, it's like everything's symbology and everything symbolizes something. And I got caught in that trap, seeing things as if they were signals from something and tying it to the spiritual meaning of X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, or not.
Yes, that's interpreting.
Right.
That's interpreting, and that's what the DSM does. It's like, oh, this means this. Yeah. And what Jenlin would say is, maybe it does just as you're saying, but instead of putting it between us so that everything I hear from you, I'm now interpreting as, coming from this thing like pathology. Yeah. Let's put it beside us. And then let me maybe offer it up to you as a potential for something that might help you as a way of understanding yourself. Yeah. But it's not the truth. No. Your body knows the truth.
Right. And that's, I think when you explain that to people, and we all have that sense when someone says something that doesn't resonate with us, and we will use this language in normal life. It's like, that doesn't quite feel right. That's exactly what's happening. Like somebody's layering a meaning on top of something that you don't necessarily physiologically agree with. And that's sort of maybe anthropomorphizing the body, but it is it's a resonant field. It's it's a felt yes to that thing or a no. That's not
that
what
is
it
the
is.
Felt sense when your body goes, yeah, that fits. That's a shift too that comes, right? Yeah. Or it's like, no, that I don't feel sick, or I don't feel like I'm bad, or whatever that is. No, I'm not actually confused about why I did X. And that comes from just right inside in our own experience. Yeah. But then let's go to this because it's important. Yeah. So bodies know all these things and they're wise, but when they get in and stuck in that trauma feedback loop, they get stuck in this kind of immobilized state of going back and forth in the neural pathways of trauma, of flight, fight, and then freezing, and then folding into the self and shutting down. Yeah. And that's where then we can't trust what we're feeling inside. Right. And that's what then becomes so traumatizing in and of itself.
Yes, deeply traumatizing, because you may have dissociated originally, and therefore there's that pattern, and then you can't actually trust your own instincts and your own impulses physiologically, and then you're stuck in a place where you're not even safe with yourself, and that just becomes a whole feedback loop of more trauma.
Yeah, which is what happens in trauma often, right? Is that kids feel into something, they know something's wrong, but it's not validated. Right. The body knows it's wrong to be abused, but if it's not in any way validated around you, then you feel like you're crazy. You can't read what your body feels. Yeah. So it's complex, and that's our job, right? Is to help people to recognize when it's a trauma feedback loop. And that's why it's so important to understand what state you're in the nervous system. Yeah. It's really important. Because then once you get that, I call it orienting, to what we call the 6 Fs, which we'll get to. So those are the states in the nervous system that we've named. And when you don't know where you are and you're just flying around like that, you can't make sense out of anything. And making sense out of your life is what helps to ground.
Right. I think it's the thing that sometimes we lose. I was talking to someone about this yesterday in terms of like, yes, maybe we're making up the meaning, but meaning is a really important part of how we orient, to use your word, to our life, our own existence. We kind of need to sense make, because this brain can't just switch off and just accept everything carte blanche and just go. It's like it needs to have a way of computing life that feels, again, it's a felt sense, it's making sense, but it lands differently, that feels kind of resonant.
Yeah. Well, Gemlin, one of his first books, he called Experiencing and the Creation of Meaning.
Interesting.
So how we create meaning out of our experiencing.
Yeah.
That's important, because having meaning really, in so many ways, it's the source of what is meaningful, is
Right.
valuable to us in life, right? What means something to us. It's deep inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's connected, I think, to our identity and our value system, which is really challenged in addiction. People end up doing things that they would never normally do, that violate their value systems, because they've lost the grounding in that ventral branch, that grounded, safe branch of the nervous system that connects up here with the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of us that says, do this, don't do this, that's not okay. Think about this, you better get on that, da 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 da. And that goes to sleep when you're in the trauma loop.
Yeah. And then, of course, you get programs like,
right, to give to people, is to say, you're not a bad person. You're not, there's no devil in the corner doing push-ups. No, this is the way bodies work.
Right. And it's a totally different approach to like the 12-step model, where I don't know which step it is, but you've got to go and apologize for all the terrible things you did. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, shame trigger. It's just like further traumatizing the person who only did those things to feel safe. It's such a twisted system.
I mean, we're not saying that you aren't responsible for hurting other people and for yourself, because I never want people to think that this model minimizes suffering or the damage that's done with addiction or dissociation or multiple, all of those things.
Yeah.
For people that you're in relationship with, if you disappear into dissociation down the rabbit hole, you abandon them.
Yeah.
Abandon the people that you care about and love, or your children. This is terrible. Nobody's denying that. But we're saying that's just how bodies work.
Right.
That's all it is. That's all that it is. That's all addictions are. They shift you back and forth. Yes, they're complicated in terms of chemistry and all of that, and withdrawal and blah, 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 for some of them, not all of them. But that really is what they do in order to help us to survive. And so you get what I call these moments of liberation for people that come much more quickly than I've seen happen in other models, because it's just rooted in, this is how bodies are. You're not sick, you're not bad. You're just doing what any body is programmed to do to survive.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So let's talk about your kind of in clinical practice, shall we say, or just for people to have an idea of, okay, so we've talked about a lot of concepts, but what are we actually talking about, and how can I map and track and understand where my nervous system is? Let's get into that. And anybody who's listening to this, we are going to put a diagram in the show notes, but what we're going to do now is share screen. So if you're on YouTube, you will see this. And so we can actually point to a diagram, because it's always better to see things visually.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to share screen.
Yeah, for sure.
So because I am a very visual person, I just ended up making a visual model of the nervous system. And I did this in conjunction with clients and with students. I have a community here where I teach focusing, and we have students and trainers, people that take courses and whatever. So we came up with, we called it, to make it simple, we called it the 6 Fs.
Yeah.
Because we already had flight, fight,
Yeah.
and we already had freeze. So we thought, okay, let's keep going and find more Fs that relate to the nervous system. So here we see there are these 3 basic branches of the autonomic nervous system. The one down here, can you see my cursor?
Yeah, for sure.
We called flock.
Right.
Flock is about coming together, joining. It's what Steve Porges calls the social engagement system.
Yeah.
When we're in a grounded, safe place, bodies are wired to connect and enjoy each other. And you see the face opens and there's smiling and connecting, and all is good, in this place of flock. And we do this. We flock together when we're suffering too. Funerals are places where people come, memorial services, they come to be together because it feels good to connect and co-regulate with each other when we're in need.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the grounded place that in the nervous system is called the ventral branch of the vagus. And Steve talks about this as the place of health and growth and restoration. So this is where we are aiming to bring our clients into, at least to feel safe enough to have moments that feel like that inside their own body.
Right.
Because there are some people who live in this world who will never be safe on the outside. People like trans people, people who are different than the way we're supposed to be. And
that was such an important part in your book, actually. I read that, and I really, sometimes I think we can aim towards external safety as the thing that everyone says is the right thing to have. And I have a complex genetic connective tissue disorder, which means that my felt sense of safety is always going to be slightly not derived from where other people might find it. And I really got that from when I read that section of your book. I was like, oh, it's not about the environment has to always be safe, because for some people that just isn't a possibility. And yet it doesn't mean that life always is traumatic, and there is a different way to find that safety.
Yes, and I learned that from Sandra Butler 40 years ago when I went. She was amazing feminist therapist who wrote one of the first books on incest called The Conspiracy of Silence. And she said, somebody in the audience said, well, how are we supposed to help our clients feel safe when, they'll say, well, you can't guarantee safety. You can't tell me I'm always going to be safe, which is totally true. And she said, it's very important to me that I have moments right here and right now in this moment where I feel safe. Yeah. Just in this moment.
Yes.
And really, Victoria, that's all we have. Because because who knows? My husband just went to the dentist. God forbid something happens. You don't know. My kids are off doing whatever they're doing. I mean, I presume no news is good news, but that's really all we ever have.
Yes.
It's just that for a lot of us who live in very, privileged places and lives, we don't think about that.
Of course. Yeah.
Unless something bad happens, right?
Yeah.
Then we feel unsafe. And then we go up into this place in our nervous system of flight, fight. So we either, some of us are pretty wired to go to fight as a default place. And you'll know people like this, in the background, they're always a bit pissed off, and you can just feel it in them. It's just like they're looking for something to grab a hold of, to be angry about. And that's because they're stuck in fight. It's not fun. It's not like they like it. But in understanding that, you can really help people, because our job is to bring them back down into these practices that bring them back into a state of flock. As much as possible. And then the other part of that, of course, is flight. It's like, how can I get out of here? This isn't safe, and how can I get out of here? And then when we can't do either of those things to mobilize, the body goes to what we called folding in. and collapsing. And this is the branch of the vagus that Steve Porges named as the dorsal. This is an old primitive part of the nervous system. Yeah, the playing dead part. So that's what he gave, a lot of what he gave us. There are many things in polyvagal theory, but that's a big one, right? Because all of us as trauma therapists said, oh, we know that place. Just like you were saying, well, wait a minute, I don't feel sympathetic. I feel pretty numb and shut down.
Right.
Yeah. And so he's saying, no, that's part of the autonomic nervous system.
Yeah.
And indeed it is.
Yeah. And
sorry,
I was just going to say, and within that, coming from a functional medicine place, so many of the illnesses that arise from that state, because I want to make it really clear to people, it is a chemical state. Like we call it cell danger response syndrome in medicine. So essentially the cellular, basically to do with the way the cell uptakes energy, the sodium channels, calcium channels, it just slows down. Your body is literally making less ATP because the whole cell goes stop. And physiologically, you can get stuck in that state. And then we get, ME, CFS, all of those sorts of things. It's a physiological reality of playing dead. It is exactly like it would be in the wild.
Yeah, exactly. Heart rate goes down, all of it. That's what happened with those little babies that Steve saw.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see it because bodies hold the shapes differently. And this is what I also saw back then with these young women, is that when they would be in this sympathetic place, of course, muscles are constricted.
Yeah.
You would feel this, right? And then when they would dissociate, bodies collapse and often turn kind of white. And that can be very scary and dangerous.
Yeah.
You actually die in that state. So the work we do is important. Yeah.
Seriously so, yes.
And then freeze is misunderstood often by people. So freeze is not this. It's not collapse. Freeze is a blended state that combines the sympathetic rush of adrenaline into constriction and the collapse and immobilization of the dorsal branch. And so freeze and fixate is where addictions kind of live, and they shift you back and forth. This is the propeller. Between flight, fight, and then down to fold, or between fold and back to flight, fight. So here would be the place where these endogenous opioids are released, and then people numb and get relief. And that's the really typical pattern. And then the other one is the really risk-taking behaviors that shift you back out of this deadened state that feels awful for people. It's awful. And then down here, so you see in the model, so this is the trauma feedback loop. This is where people are living when they're in these addictive places most of the time. Right? Now down here is the ventral pathway. This is where when the branch of the vagus, the ventral branch that's above the diaphragm, it goes right up in through the ear, around into the face. And when this branch of the vagus is activated, you can see it's very yellow. We use these body cards to draw the felt sense of these places. And almost everybody draws yellow.
Yeah, wow.
In the safe places. Yeah, it's very interesting. So that's why I made it yellow. So then here is fun and fired up. So this is the place of like where we play and have fun together. And you can see that there's mobilization and fun, right? The kids are out there playing and they're laughing and jumping and whatever. But as soon as a threat happens, you'll hear crying or fighting, because they've shifted up into the sympathetic branch in the nervous system. And they've lost the safety of flock. And that's a really clear way of identifying the shifts in the body.
Right.
I added fired up because I realized when I was thinking about, well, where am I these days? I'm definitely in fired up most of the time. So I feel flock, I feel connected and safe. Generally speaking, although God only knows how safe anybody really feels in the world these days.
Right.
Seriously, though, really. But I also am aware of feeling a lot of kind of that sympathetic rush of fired up, of feeling passionate,
Yep.
wanting to get the message across, also having a lot of fun along the way.
Yes.
And because that's really important, right? That the people that you work with and you're doing this work, that you have fun together.
Yeah.
It's very important because it's hard work.
Yes. And we spend so much of our time talking about trauma that actually to actually have fun about it.
Exactly.
Yes,
And that's
essential.
what I do in my addiction groups. It's like, we can play, we can have fun, you know? And then over here, in flow, this is where the nervous system blends, say, enough safety in the moment with the safety of immobilizing and being still.
Yeah.
So flow is like focusing practice if you're sitting still with your partner. It's lovemaking. It's breastfeeding if you feel safe, or giving birth even if you feel safe. It's all these wonderful ways that we can slow things down and feel into a calm place inside. And so our job, right, as trauma therapists is to help our clients to identify and orient to where they are in their nervous system, and then to help them kind of find a felt sense of these places in the nervous system, these ventral places. And we do that through psychotherapy, through somatic work within the body, through even things like, playing the piano, these daily practices that help people, reminding people if they're living indoors a lot, how about the idea of getting up and going outside once a day and making a point of intentionally making eye contact with one person. See if that would be okay. If your body, so we always work in collaboration with. See if it would be okay. You could invite your body to make a little eye contact with somebody that's giving you coffee. You might say, "How are you doing today?" Just see if it would be okay. And maybe it's not, and that's okay too. Just might not feel safe enough. So we use this model a lot. I also have a clinician model that's a lot more complex. And then there's another way that we work using the 3-circle practice. So this is a practice that comes from Patrick Cairns' work. He's a guy who has done a lot of work with sex addiction. He wrote Out of the Shadows. He's a pretty sort of traditional guy in a lot of ways, but he's very, very smart man. And I really liked this 3-circle practice. And what I did is I integrated the nervous system into it. So we'll go through it. This is an example of how what we would use with somebody, say, who, and I usually always work in groups with people now. It's just so much better to work in groups.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And so the inner circle is the place where you want to, over time, when bodies feel safe enough, to place in there some kind of harm reduction that you want to engage in, and it can be complete sobriety if that's what you're choosing to do, to manage some of the behaviors that you are feeling are either really bad habits or you really feel like they've become addictive.
Right.
And my definition of addiction is really simple, just something that hurts you. It helps you in the short term. So say with these young women, cutting their bodies helped them in the short term because it activated endogenous opioids and the dorsal vagus. It hurt them in the long term because it's self-harming to hurt your body, to cut your body. And they eventually it was addictive. They couldn't stop doing it because it brought relief. It just works really well. So so in here, we really take our time to name some of these behaviors, because there's almost always more than one, because bodies are smart and they'll look for different ways that you can kind of use to get into some relieving state.
Yeah.
And so we take our time with this, and it's very harm reduction, and it really works in conjunction with the body, because we recognize that the body's not going to shift unless it feels safe enough to begin to do that, which often means that we're working on the outer circle of building a good life, right?
Yes.
This is a bit like Marsha Linehan's, living the life worth living.
Right.
I love that when she talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't always start here.
Yeah.
Some people want to start here because they're in crisis, and they say, look, I've got to stop watching porn.
Right.
And there's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's got to be total, because it's getting me into big trouble. My wife's going to leave me.
Yeah.
So we put that there because, okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But then we might go to this outer circle of, well, what are you going to do if you're not doing that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm going to walk the dog, or I'm going to go play the piano, or I'm going to join hockey again. I mean, these are basic things that
so simple, but really essential
practices that, And then I might do some journaling. I might connect up with my focusing partner and do some focusing. And then the middle circle are the places in the nervous system where we get triggered and activated.
Yeah.
So I'm waking up this morning. I'd encourage people to do this every day. Wake up this morning, put both of these models in front of you. Some people put them on their phone.
Yeah.
Some people put them on the fridge.
Yeah.
And you can use them with your kids too. Kids love this because it's playful and fun too.
For sure.
And then say to yourself, okay, where am I? You know, where am I in the 6 steps? Well, I'm kind of in this flight fight place here.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what's going on today? I had that argument with so-and-so yesterday, at a conflict, with work. Or listen, I feel targeted by racism every time I go out the door.
Yeah.
Or misogyny. Yeah. I'm living in this state chronically. And so what do I need to do to be particularly mindful today? Because I really feel at risk. Okay, let's look at what I've got listed over here. I'm going to hang out and cuddle my cat for the first 20 minutes before I do anything. It's that kind of very intentional self-care.
It's so, and I think people devalue or undervalue awareness so much. Like, just having diagrams and things to look at gives you a check-in point where you can actually, it's not get up, look at the phone, like run to the shower, go to...
No, get up and slowly bring your awareness into the felt sense as much as you can.
Right.
Into your body. What kind of a day do you want to have?
Yeah.
And with addiction, and particularly with people that have been walking down these neural pathways, these addictive neural pathways for, sometimes 30 years.
Yeah.
Even 5 years, even 2. I mean, but especially if it's a long haul, you have to do this every day.
Yeah.
That's the hard part. But here, listen to the good part. First of all, what a great way to live your life. Practicing being intentional and a loving human being every day. Yeah. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And secondly, if you do this every day, there's every evidence to believe that you will be wiring your body into the ventral vagus and not acting out with addiction, because addiction does not occur here.
Yes. Yeah.
There's no need for it. You're not shifting back and forth between dysregulated states.
Yeah.
At least not chronically. I mean, we all do that somewhat because we need to. A loud noise happens. Of course, you want your body to go up into sympathetic.
Right.
But I mean chronically.
Yeah. And it's like, what I see is that the pen bouncing in the top end of your previous diagram with that, it's very jerky, it's bouncing, it's seesawing from one to the other. It's like playing tennis with yourself inside your nervous system. Whereas actually the reality is that everything should flow very gently. It should like go up when you need loud noise. Okay, up. Oh no, it was nothing to worry about. Whereas some people can have that experience and get stuck in that kind of charge of like panic, startled.
The more trauma pathway you have, the more they will. And in fact, they've done really interesting studies with that, with groups of people who had post-traumatic stress and people who didn't. And they did a backfiring of a car engine.
Oh, yeah.
And they timed to see how bodies dropped back into ventral.
Yeah.
And with, people that didn't have post-traumatic stress, they, oh yeah, just like you said, oh, what happened, oh yeah, car backfiring. And then in a couple of minutes, I think their heart rate settled back down and blah, blah, blah. But with people with post-traumatic stress, it took hours sometimes.
Yeah. And it's fundamental to like help people realize that it is these ventral vagal practices that change that. So I've had a lot of stuff in my life. I'm sure you have in yours. And there are times when I'm in weeks, if not months, of having hypervigilance, that my startle response is too much because I'm kind of like had all the middle circle here, all the triggers, stuff's happening. You put COVID restrictions in your example. And I'm like, yeah, that was a really stressful like couple of years we've just lived through. And it's still there on the horizon and it does affect. But it is this kind of, the having access to practices which can self-soothe almost, but in a neutral or beneficial way that allows us to access that ventral vagal branch of who we are, literally changes how stressed you will get and how long it will last when those triggers occur.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's the good news, right? Is that, and because, we have this way of now just really reinforcing and understanding through polyvagal theory why that works well, and also neuroscience. So one of my, the model is based on 5 different theories, and one of them is Mark Lewis's learning model of addiction, because I thought, well, if the sickness model doesn't make sense to me, then what is it? And I went hunting around, I found his work, which is just wonderful work, The Biology of Desire. And Mark was a heroin addict.
Oh, wow.
So he was 30 years old. He wrote Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, where he used 2 kind of stories that he wove together. One was his own story of being a heroin addict, growing up as a kid and moving to California he's in Toronto too, like I am. And then the other story was how he became a neuroscientist and how understanding neuroplasticity and that addictions are really just the ways that the brain learns how to respond and develops these bad habits.
Yeah.
And you can change that. We know that now with neuroplasticity.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And I hope that everyone's got a load of value out of just seeing these examples. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, because everyone needs to know all of this. It's just my theory.
These things are all available. They're downloadable on my website, janwinhall.com.
I will absolutely link that in the show notes. And I was just going to say, so how can people find out more about you, work with you? What are you offering at this moment in time? Because I know there will be people who will be like, I need more of this woman.
Yes, I hope so. Yeah. And the beauty of it is that this model goes with any kind of therapy that you're doing. It's not, we're not saying this is it, this is the only, it's a generic model that helps you understand interoception with felt sensing and neuroception, the autonomic nervous system. So I also have an embodied assessment and treatment tool that helps us to make assessments out of what we're doing so that we can understand what is it that we're doing and how is it working,
Interesting.
So janwinhall.com is my website, and pretty well everything I'm doing is on there. I have a certification course that's coming up on the Polyvagal Institute. I'm really excited about that. You can sign up for it now. And it's a 6-month course with a certification from PVI on trauma and addiction treatment, and also a certification from the Focusing Institute on focusing proficiency. Because there's a whole training thing there too, which I train in, and becoming a focusing oriented therapist. So
great.
And the gathering is in October.
Yes, I'm so excited because
where we're both going to meet each other.
We're both going to meet each other. Yes.
Oh my God.
I know. And it's such a, like, we chatted a couple of weeks back and you mentioned it. And I was like, going to go. So this will be out before that gathering. So it is in Florida. If anyone wants to join us live, we'll put the link in the show notes. But there is a Polyvagal Institute gathering.
I also do groups. I still do. I don't really want to stop that ever, I still see people. I run an addiction group where we use this model. And I also have a focusing oriented therapy group for women where we do really beautiful, deep, embodied, felt sensing work online, building in enough safety that people have support where they are and whatever. But
wonderful. Yeah. I love all of this. And I'm going to make sure that we tag everything in the show notes and put everything there. I will also post all of this in the new Unveiled community that I've created, which is an online community space, because I'm really passionate about bringing all of these ideas together, because there's so many people talking about stuff.
Yeah, it's great.
It's not always accessible to the general public. It's why I have a podcast. But your training and the certification, I think, is brilliant. And everyone says, well, why are you promoting other people's certifications when you have one yourself? And I'm like, no, everyone needs to learn all the things. Everything needs to exist. And so we will absolutely make sure that I put all of this everywhere, because having good people talk about this kind of, what's the best way to describe it? This very centered, self-first perspective of any condition, illness, behavior, addiction, whatever we want to call it. I want to create enough noise about that so that we drown out the DSM and the pathologizing.
So do I, Victoria. So do I. So really looking forward to meeting you.
Absolutely. And spending time together.
I love your inclusivity. I don't like what has happened in the trauma world with so much competition around this training and that training, and this one's the best. And that's not the way we want it to be. We want to collaborate and really rejoice in everybody's work.
Well, it's how it all started as well. When you look at the people who did this, like Porges and Levine and all the way, they hung out together and talked about it. And all of the models that have come off the back of that, it's collaborative. I have a big passion for getting brilliant brains in rooms together, because I think we've been speaking about this for the last hour and 15 minutes. The magic that happens in community and togetherness is infinitely better than we can do on our own. So,
well, also have a look then at, I did this amazing, we did a forum called Integrating Addiction and Trauma Treatment through the United States Association of Body Psychotherapies. And we had Gabor Mate and Steve Porges and myself and Aileen Lapierre, who does neuroaffective touch.
Yeah.
And two other people, and I'm blocking on their names right now, who did research. And also running an addiction treatment center that's more embodied. So was really fun. It was like an hour and a half or 2 hours, I guess, that we were together. We had a panel and we shared, and it was amazing. So those are, exactly. And of course, I mean, for me, the roots of this is feminist therapy.
Yes.
And we desperately tried to work collaboratively. We weren't always successful, but we tried.
Yes. And just this working together, it feels so nourishing to our nervous systems, because I think, as you touched on very lightly, vicarious trauma is the thing in this industry that we can be at risk for, because we're dealing with people's darkest secrets. And so as healers, people in this world, being together and having collaboration around it, I think is just fundamentally important. So,
yes, I call that the hot potato in my book. Do you remember?
I do.
You've got this hot potato of the horrible thing somebody told you. What are you going to do with it? Nobody wants it.
Right. No. So I'm also going to track down your article that you wrote and with Stephen Porges and put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah. Okay. I'll send you a bunch of things
so that everyone can geek out on all of this. And I know I have a lot of listeners who are like in this world, and all of my students as well. And I'm going to make sure that we put this in my training, because I love this conversation. And I just thank you for spending so much time with me, Jan. I've really appreciated this.
No, I've really enjoyed it, and I really look forward to meeting you. It'd be great.
Yes. Wasn't Jan amazing? I am blown away by the amount of content and models and theories and usages of these kind of insights into human mechanics, essentially, are available in this world. If you're interested in attending the Polyvagal Institute gathering and the Safe and Sound Summit that is coming up in October in Florida and also virtually, the links for that are in the show notes. Please go and tell Jan Winhall how much you appreciated her contribution and her sharing of her wisdom with us on today's episode. And with that said, if you are interested in following any more of the work of Unveil, please join the Unveil community. Head to unveilcommunity.com and join in the conversation. All of our Unveil Academy students are there. I'm there. A lot of our tribe are there. And we are having these kind of conversations in person. So if that's something that you're interested in, please do join us now.